This podcast is brought to you by PwC.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of our Family Office Insights podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Tomas Hurcik, who's the co-founder and CEO of ORCA. Welcome, Tomas.
Thanks for having me, Lisa.
Thank you. So can we start by, can you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us how you got into the world of family offices?
Yeah, very happy to do so. So you've said it already. My name's Tomas. I am the co-founder CEO of ORCA. I started this company about 8 years ago. Prior to this, I'd worked in 3 tech firms, loved always dealing with technology, but zero family office exposure. And I happened to be married to my high school sweetheart, who was in the fortunate position of having her own single family office. And it was, in fact, when we got married and when my wife relocated to Switzerland to live with me, that I was very abruptly introduced to the complexity of what it means to have a large ownership structure.
Right. So what? Oh, sorry, go on.
No. And yeah, we really, I got the first-hand insight into the pain that was there, not in owning all of these assets. I think that's the nice side of things, but specifically in her example, it was relocating to Switzerland involved having to, get a tax ruling, having to seek advice from independent experts with whom they'd never spoken before in the family office. My wife was the first family member, I think in about 5 generations, to ever relocate her tax domicile. Okay. So it really hit hard. And, that insight really showed me that there was a lot that could be done here with technology.
Yeah. I mean, that's what you're describing as a situation that we see very often is families having to grapple with it. So that was the starting point, the inspiration for ORCA. So when you started looking, what did you then see?
Well, I think my wife and I first, tried to solve the problem. We were taking a lot of information from the family office and trying to synthesize it and present it to a lawyer here in Switzerland. And I think we dealt with that the way everyone deals with it. It was a structure chart. There were Excel files with tax IDs and important sort of supporting information. And then the documents, were all over the place. We didn't really have a structured approach to that. My wife and I are both, I'd say, very well organized individuals. We have a healthy amount of OCD, but even we struggled to know how to organize this information and how to present it. And we really realized that, if you aren't able to present information to an external party who's looking at it and trying to deal with a very important topic of, what is relevant, what is unrelevant for the tax ruling, et cetera, then you're costing a lot of time, which ends up in very high legal fees in our specific instance. And also you introduce a lot of risk into the process because if you forget something, if if it's not presented well and you kind of miss it, you can have substantial implications, which thankfully we didn't. But just the risk of that was enough to scare us into thinking there was a business idea here.
Yeah. And it is so true because when you're working with professionals and we're putting together something that's going to the authorities, we know all of the information we need, but we don't know how that applies to your situation, and you're then trying to find the information, and we see it very, very often. I can see that there was a real business idea there.
Yes, yeah. And it was somewhat serendipitous at the time. I was reading a book about databases and structuring information, and there are...
It sounds a fascinating read.
These are the things I do in my free time, yes. I think a lot of the way information is organized digitally is a copy-paste of how we treat it in the physical world. Folders and documents, and one document only in one folder, et cetera. And when you embrace the fact that when you go digital, you can structure things entirely differently, you open up a world of possibilities. And that's really what we've done over the last 8 years with ORCA.
And so how then, if we're looking at the world of family offices specifically, what is it about the family office landscape that then, in addition to what you've said already, requires this kind of solution? What was it that you were seeing?
I think there was an overarching trend in the direction of a lot more investments a lot, whether it's the certain investment minimums have gone down, whether it's the advent of new asset classes, whether it's people investing really globally instead of just in their home country. We saw a lot of families really proliferating the number of things that they were doing, and doing so in a number of different jurisdictions. And at the same point in time, sometimes collectively, sometimes individually. So a lot of complexity just in even understanding who's doing what. And the regulatory environment has also, not stayed stagnant, to put it that way, and the amount of red tape that was coming down was just more and more and more. So not only are people doing more things in more places, and it's not just the investments that they're doing in more places, they're also more mobile geographically. And, I listened to some of the other podcasts you guys have done. It's great content. And, hearing about the large moves, for example, from the UK now to Switzerland and so on and so forth, that mobility also leads to, the requirement for needing to aggregate information, needing to present information, needing to make important life decisions about structuring of assets, etc. I think there was a huge trend in all of those directions, and there was just a lack of a dedicated solution for this problem.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when I first started working, which was quite a long time ago, and the very first client I worked on was under investigation in the UK. And we went through a very long tax inquiry, and it was all resolved, all fine, everything was sorted out. And then about a week later, he called and he said he'd forgotten about a bank account that he hadn't told the authorities about. And I was like, oh, well, no, it's fine. I'm sure we'll be able to fix it. And then it turned out that there was, I don't know, £12 million in this bank account that he'd forgotten about. And I couldn't conceptually get my head around, well, how can you have forgotten about this bank account? But then when we went to his house, I saw why, because he had boxes and boxes of paper. And this was a long time ago. It's a different world. But there were so many pieces of paper that he was trying to grapple with that he genuinely hadn't got an idea of everything that he had. And so I can fully see those issues. And it does get more acute because there is more information flying around all the time, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think the generally people used to have, or I mean, it's a very broad generalization, but to say, if you had a family business, you'd have sort of 95% of the assets tied up in that.
Yeah.
And nowadays, I think you really see a huge amount of activity outside of the main operating businesses, and that makes the paperwork proliferate even more.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this before. There's the necessary evils, I think, is what you call them, that family offices have to grapple with, that mean that you need to have a handle on this data. So what are those, and what does that mean?
So we lovingly call them the necessary evils, I have to add. Ultimately, it's tax, it's legal, it's compliance, right? So I think one thing we were talking about earlier, if you've seen one family office, that's precisely that. You've seen just one. They're so diverse, do a lot of different things. But what unites all of them is that no matter what they do, what assets they invest in, which jurisdictions they're operating in, small, big, medium-sized offices, they will all have to deal with tax, legal, and compliance. Yeah. Those topics aren't going anywhere. The tendency is they're just getting more complex. And I think one thing we picked up around those topics is they're always related with liaising with the outside world. Yeah. So, a family office can decide which art it's going to buy totally without anybody else understanding at any point in time that they've just acquired this or this or this. But when it comes to tax, legal, compliance, you will always need to liaise with the outside world, right? I mean, family offices are the tendency is to have a small team. Tendency is to have the team, working on the things that are closest to the family specifically. That's not necessarily tax, legal, and compliance. Yeah. And in a small team, you probably won't have the expertise to deal with all of the jurisdictions that you're working in, or you just want a second opinion. And so there's this huge necessity to share information with people outside of the office, either, with a bank so that you can open a bank account, or with someone to talk about succession, or to get the opinions in terms of succession. If you have family members in 3 different jurisdictions, you might need to liaise with tax experts in 3 different jurisdictions, or more, right? So this was the problem we saw. People not only needed, it's not just that you have to deal the admin and the paperwork that comes with having a family office and doing a lot of interesting things, but it's the fact that you also constantly need to be able to share that information with chosen people outside of the office. And importantly, our clients like to say, sharing without ever oversharing, right?
Yeah. And I mean, it's an important point. I think we see lots of clients still sharing things by email or sending attachments or using Excel. And it leads to the question of, is that really the most secure way to handle your data? I think not. And we've talked about cybersecurity in an earlier podcast, but what do you see in that space? Is that a risk that family offices are concerned about?
Absolutely. I think it's security is it's a mandatory discussion with specifically with any technology anyone's using nowadays. We will have extensive discussions about this with all of the clients that we work with, and it's an absolute hard requirement, right? It's not a soft topic. And there's some interesting approaches people are taking. I would definitely say what you said, email, Excel, there are better alternatives to this. Also, there's more user-friendly alternatives to this. A good example, when my wife and I were dealing with lots of documents flying around, you'd have to send, email 1 of 5. You just have to zip all the documents, right? And then password protect them and everything. Just the time spent on doing things like that. And if you can leverage technology, you can do that in 2 clicks. You've done what took us effectively 20-25 minutes.
Yeah, 100% agree. So if there's a family office listening or a family listening and they're thinking, well, how do I get started? What do I do? 'Cause going from current state to future state, I guess, is a challenge in this world. What would your advice be there?
Sure. I think, and there's obviously a solution that involves ORCA to that question, but there's also just a general sort of response, right? If families are having to deal with lots of information, which undoubtedly they will be, if they're having to share that with a lot of external people, the first step I would advise anyone is to make sure you have all of your own information, right? Very frequently we'll encounter people who have some information with the tax attorney in the UK, others with the tax attorney in Switzerland, yet additional information held in a vault somewhere or someone's private computer, etc. And it makes the whole process of discussing things like succession, etc., very difficult. And there's the risk of omission, as you'd pointed out, right? So the first step for us is always just getting the information in one place. That doesn't necessarily mean it's useful to you. You then have to organize it. That's a little bit more laborious topic. And this is where ORCA, basically, we talk about getting our clients organized. So
very nice.
Thank you. That was actually suggested by one of our clients. And we just have a very specific way we organize information that is 100% purpose-built for these reasons, right? And it takes a lot of the ambiguity out of it, because I've seen countless clients where you'll have, okay, we've got all the information, but how do we now make sense of it? How do we now file it away?
Yeah.
And I've even encountered an office where we had 2 professional archivists on staff.
Oh, wow, really?
They couldn't agree on a folder system. So they have 2 folder systems, and every document is filed away multiple times, right? And there's no checks and balances in that process. There's nothing else. So that's the second step. The first step for me is everyone should always have their own information. The second step is, how do you make sense of that? We have a really solid approach, tried and tested from ORCA's side. Sadly, I can't advise as to how someone should set up their folders, etc. I think that's very personal.
Yeah. And so I think I know the answer to this then. What would be the one tip as a last question that you would give to any family office struggling with data management?
So I would say, it really is about making sure you own your information.
Yeah.
And you be the one who has to have a copy of everything. Other people can also have copies, but you need to make sure that you have a copy. And there's a lot of advantages to that. On the one hand side, you know you have everything that you need. On the other hand side, you can gain independence. So if anybody has information and for whatever reason a relationship sours and you no longer have access to it, that's not a risk if you have your own information.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's loads of other additional reasons as to why that's advantageous. But I would definitely say for everyone, make sure you own your own data.
Yeah, good advice. Well, Tomas, thank you so much for joining us. It's really interesting to hear about it. And we'll post a link to ORCA when we send this podcast out. Thanks very much,
Lisa.
Have a good day. Bye.